Welcome to another edition of the Pro Football Focus IDP podcast, The Nickel. I am your host, Walton Spurlin, and once again, so happy to be joined by the number one Los Angeles Rams fan and one of the best IDP minds out there in the business, Mr. Ross Miles.
Thank you very much, Wally. Thank you very much. I guess I'm here to wish you a happy Thanksgiving for the week ahead, and otherwise I'm getting over the Rams losing this week. It's not too bad. Good defensive game. I really enjoyed it. To be honest, I'm not too down in the dumps because it's just nice to see a good Rams football team that plays good football. So after so many years of supporting a team that has been difficult to watch, I'm just pretty happy with it, to be honest. So yeah, hopefully we'll see them again in the playoffs.
Right, and I'm hoping that they softened up the Minnesota Vikings for that Thanksgiving Day game against my Detroit Lions, who somehow managed to back into a victory last week against the Chicago Bears in a game they tried to give away, but ended up pulling out in the end. So both our teams are definitely improved and something to cheer a little bit more for than we have in the past. But we got a lot to get to this week as we take a look back at Week 11 and a look forward to Week 12. So let's jump into some news and notes. And in Dallas, they suffered another injury to the linebacker position, which they can ill afford with Sean Lee already ruled out for their Thanksgiving Day game. And now it looks like Anthony Hitchens is dealing with a groin issue.
Yeah, that's definitely what we're hearing. Habib Hitchens himself said, as of right now, I'm playing Thanksgiving and I'm looking forward to it, but we're not quite as convinced. Groin injuries tend to linger. If you're an owner of Jalen Smith, this is sending his stock rising for sure.
Right, yeah, and Justin Durant even saw some snaps last week, but I think the player you'd be leaning on, if anyone in Dallas, if you're in a situation where you need a linebacker, would be Jalen Smith. I believe he played 36 snaps to 25 for Durant, and yeah, Hitchens is optimistic he'll play, but that's going to be probably a game-time decision, so it'll be good to have somebody in place. And boy, let's talk about the defensive line position here for a few minutes, or a minute or so, whatever we want to do. They lost a couple of players, and as we've mentioned so many times in the past, this is a thin position to begin with, and now the Saints have lost Alec Okafor with a torn Achilles. He's going to miss the rest of the season, and it looks like the Browns' Emmanuel Ogbah is going to be done for the season with a broken foot. Touch a little bit on those situations, Ross.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for fantasy owners because both guys are kind of on the fringe of fantasy relevance. Probably Ogbah a little bit more than Okafor, although Okafor may have gained a following, considering he had been having a fairly decent season. He'd had 4.5 sacks and generally been getting pressure fairly consistently since the Saints have turned it around. So the fact both of these guys are now on the sidelines for the fantasy playoffs might mean you want to listen to the waiver wire, and we touch on some of those people a bit later.
Right, this time of year the waiver wire is so important, so people are definitely going to want to make sure they take some notes when we start hitting on some of the waiver wire players to look out for. And, of course, you're always going to want to check out Ross's IDP waiver wire article at Pro Football Focus to be in the know. So keep up with that. Keep up with us here, and you'll be all good for the waiver wire. And speaking of all good, Clay Matthews is certainly not that. Another groin injury here. He wasn't having the greatest of seasons, really, from a fantasy standpoint, but from a Green Bay Packer standpoint, this season's going sideways in a hurry, and they can ill afford to lose another defender.
Yeah, definitely not what you wanted to hear as a Packers fan. I mean, yeah, as you've hinted at, really, Matthews has been a bit of a damp squib this year. He hasn't really generated the pressure or the sacks that we kind of come to expected from him over recent seasons. He is a player who we've seen flips inside over recent years, trying to find other ways to keep him on the field and use him, keep him productive. But I don't know. For me, Matthews at his best was when he was a pure pass rusher and being a real nuisance for opposing teams, and he just hasn't done that this year. Hopefully, but he can get his game straight, but this groin injury is going to slow him down.
Right, and I believe I mentioned a few weeks back that I didn't understand the game plan Green Bay came up with against a Lions team that struggled to protect the quarterback. And as you mentioned, Matthews wasn't just brought as an edge rusher. And now with the emergence of Blake Martinez as a inside linebacking threat, and he's been playing well, I thought that maybe Matthews might see an uptick in that, but I just can't figure out their scheme. And again, as I said, the Green Bay season, obviously without Aaron Rodgers, is a bit derailed. So that's keep an eye on Matthews to see if he can bounce back from this or if the Packers can figure out a way to use him. And now we'll move on to a couple of issues in the secondary. And the Saints' number one cornerback, Marshawn Lattimore, he's dealing with an ankle injury that's kind of had him in and out of last week's game.
Yeah, I mean, Lattimore has done a great job of capturing some attention in his rookie season. He looks really good. But whether he's going to play next week against my Rams is up in the air as well. Obviously, like you said, he left the game, came back in a little bit later, but ankle injuries are not easy ones to deal with when you're playing a position like cornerback. I guess the only plus side, if you're a Saints fan, would be that Rams' top receiver this year, Robert Woods, has a shoulder injury. So it could be, a match here where we've lost the number one corner on the Saints and the number one receiver on the Rams sideline.
Right, and that's an interesting matchup that I'm looking forward to next week. I mean, obviously, I'm looking forward to my Lions and Vikings as the Lions chase them for the division. But I'm really anxious to see, and I think it's a good barometer for the Rams going up against the Saints. I mean, they're coming off a tough game with the Vikings, and obviously the Saints have been rolling, I think, 8 in a row now. So that's going to be one you definitely want to keep an eye on. And a situation that we might not have to keep an eye on anymore for the rest of the season is that NFL Network's Mike Garofalo has reported that it looks like strong safety Cam Chancellor, who's dealing with a neck stinger issue, is going to miss the rest of the season for the Seahawks.
Yeah, it seems a slightly strange one to hear a player with a stinger missing the entire season. The rest of the season. Obviously, we're heading into week 12, but the Seahawks are definitely not out of the playoff hunt. So, they're only a game back on the Rams. We are going to play each other. Obviously, they lost a close one last week, the same as we did. So they are very much a live contender for me, at least for a wild card spot. You'd have to think. So, losing Sherman, losing Chancellor, missing Thomas for a little while, you can definitely understand why the Seahawks aren't leading the NFC West like they have been for several seasons.
Yeah, definitely. The Legion of Boom has taken a few blows this year, and I believe we have down here in our notes. I wanted to keep an eye on last night's game to see what they would do with Chancellor out. And after there were some reports that maybe Delano Hill would step in, they went the direction I figured they'd go, and it was Bradley McDougald who stepped in and played. He played 62 snaps, not the greatest line, 4 solos, 1 assist, 5 total tackles. But on the flip side of that, Delano Hill didn't play a snap. So that situation seems to have become clear. McDougald is the guy who's going to play for Chancellor. Now, I'm not certain if he's somebody that you want to run right out and snatch off the waiver wire. We'll talk waiver wire a little bit later on. But anyway, so we know who's stepping in for Chancellor anyway. And now let's touch on just real quick, and this is be something that sorts itself out in the offseason, but right here in Detroit, the Detroit Free Press is reporting that they consider that Ezekiel Ansah as a candidate for a prove-it 1-year contract. He's struggled with injuries the last couple of seasons, so it's unlikely the Lions are going to invest a multi-year deal in him without perhaps one of these 1-year prove-it deals, and he might have to gamble on himself, Ross.
I think so. It's an interesting one because Ansah, he's clearly a very talented individual. When he was drafted, he didn't have much experience, and he's definitely paid down on that and showed he's a very talented pass rusher. But as you said, injuries over the last few years have really slowed him. If you're Detroit, you've got Matthew Stafford's contract, and there's other people on that roster that do want paying, I would imagine. So is Ansah somebody you're going to keep around, bearing in mind he hasn't produced? I get the feeling we might see him elsewhere next season. Just for me, when you're looking at I guess it depends on how much loyalty he feels to the Lions franchise, but the prove-it deal to me with your home team you've always been with feels a little bit of a slap in the face. I don't know. I just think you might find someone else to pay him that little bit more.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out because when healthy, he's a disruptive force and had a very good season, double-digit sacks. But again, injuries have sapped him of the ability to get after the quarterback the way he did in that standout season. And he's played well against the run when he's been in there. But again, it's how often has he been in there? But talking about a defensive lineman is a nice segue to get us right in to the defensive lineman. And I believe, for me, Ross, I put down in my notes as I was watching the games and just looking over some of the stat lines, this was a bounce-back week for the defensive line after we'd talked about how there had been a couple of down weeks.
Yeah, there were some players that put up some nice performances, and one in particular that I was very pleased to see was Derek Barnett. Obviously, he had been flagged by us last week. We said that not only was he a waiver wire grab, we really liked the matchup he had against the Cowboys, based on the fact that Adrian Clowney had an extremely productive performance playing against them, and Barnett delivered. He had 2 sacks and a forced fumble, added off 3 total tackles, and he managed to do all that on just 32 snaps. So, yeah, if you were a Barnett owner, you would have been pleasantly rewarded for his performance last week.
Yeah, indeed, and I'll give myself a quick little pat on the back, as he was one of the players that I mentioned in last week's start-sit article due to that matchup with the Tyrone Smithless Cowboys, and he definitely delivered. And as you mentioned, on only 32 snaps, and if you look at the other side of that, he's almost in a equal split rotation with Vinny Curry, because Vinny Curry played 34 snaps in that game. So you can see what they're doing at the defensive right end position right there. And I believe we talked about this. I think Barnett, obviously in the future years, for certain, is going to take over as the number one option there. But we'll see if Philadelphia, even towards the end of this season, as they make their playoff push and then drive into the playoffs, if they start to rely on the youngster a little bit more. And speaking of youngsters, we love to say this player's name. Yannick Ngakoue had quite the week. 2.5 sacks. Was it 2 forced fumbles that he had in that game, I believe? And then 3 total tackles. He's our boom or bust guy, and it was a boom week.
It was. Maybe I looked at his stat line earlier, and I noticed that he either has 2 or more sacks or none. I think his stat line reads like 2 sacks, no sacks, no sacks, 2 sacks, no sacks, 2.5 sacks, no sacks, no sacks, no sacks, 2.5 sacks. So when Ngakoue is on, he definitely pays dividends for your fantasy team, but he is a little bit prone to some of the lower scores as well. So he's kind of matchup dependent right now, but he's a guy trending in the right direction for me. If he can, round off his game a little bit, he could be a really nice DL2 moving forward.
Right, and as you look ahead at the schedule there for Jacksonville, I was just kind of taking a peek. Not a bad matchup this week at Arizona, but then they get the Colts, giving up a lot of sacks. Houston, giving up a lot of sacks. And then week 16 at San Francisco. So there are some possible boom matchups out there. And speaking of boom, Jadeveon Clowney has been bringing the boom lately. Maybe not as hard as that hit he put on the poor kid from Michigan, and I believe in one of his final college games. But Clowney, in the absence of J.J. Watt, we knew he was going to be asked to step up, and the youngster's taking it on.
He really has, yeah. A couple of sacks and 5 total tackles. It's a very impressive stat line. Arguably, to me, the most impressive part of what he's been doing is he now has a sack in each of the last 4 games. Considering that coincides with the loss of Watt and Merciless, they've asked this guy to take responsibility, and he's delivering. So that's great news. I mean, part of me is wondering where this was when the others were on the field. Is he just half a second slower than J.J. Watt, and J.J. Watt gets there first? But yeah, I mean, 8 sacks in the season. It's a career year now for Clowney. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how he works in tandem with Watt next year, when we've got other very exciting duos like Bosa and Ingram elsewhere in the league.
Right, that could be a duo to challenge the youngsters out there in Los Angeles. Again, and knock on wood, let's hope that J.J. Watt can get back to full health and stay healthy for a season, because it would be very interesting to see what kind of combination he and Clowney make. And one more performance of note, and that would be Damon Harrison, another defensive lineman to grab themselves, a defensive tackle at that, to grab themselves an interception.
Exactly. Snacks had a little pick for himself there. I love it when the big men make an in. I think you have to mention it. So, yeah, we just wanted to show some love for Damon Harrison. He's an absolute... If you play in defensive tackle required leagues, Harrison is a godsend. He is a tackle monster in the middle. And when he shows up and does something like that as well, you've got to have a big smile on your face.
Oh, yeah. And what was funny about that, going back to watch that play, I wrote down in my notes, that was a shuttle pass that he just stepped in and intercepted. And I was thinking to myself, Alex Smith, what are you thinking? I mean, how do you not see hhim? Right? I know that's a bang-bang play. Quarterback gets it, just shovels it quickly ahead to the running back. But like you said, Snacks was in there feasting, and I just made a smiley face, because it's interesting. But you don't see that happen often. But now we get to move to the waiver wire, and we've got a couple of players here, and boy, they both have interesting names. I'm going to let you go ahead and take over with the man from the Miami Dolphins.
Yeah, Davon Godchaux. I think he looks like an intriguing prospect. I just talked about, tackle monsters in the middle, and he's kind of got that look about him. He's had 18 total tackles since week 8, and that's despite he's only started 2 of the last 4 games. He isn't an every down player. He's only actually just played 52% of snaps so far this year, but when you take into account his productiveness on a play per play basis, points per opportunity stats, he ranks 5th in tackle heavy systems and 14th in balanced scoring. He really hasn't got much of a pass rush game to him, but if you're just looking for a body who's going to chunk in points week after week, without setting the house on fire, Davon Godchaux from the Miami Dolphins, he might be worth a look. And then the other guy I kind of like is down in Arizona, Olsen Pierre. Now, this is a guy who, again, hasn't been a regular starter this season. He started the last 2 games, that being said, and he's kind of playing himself into an increased role. Again, he's another player being used heavily in rotation, but since week 9, he's actually had 2 sacks and 6 hurries, adding 9 total tackles, 2 of which were for a loss. This actually makes him, again, on a points per opportunity basis, one of the top 5 defensive linemen across all scoring systems. So you can see he's been on a limited snap count. But like I said, last week he had a season high of 50%. I think that stat is trending in the right direction. He really is probably more of a DL4, so in my mind, very much a fringe fantasy performer. But if he's going to earn, increased playing time like he looks he should, he could quite quickly move up into be DL2, DL3, especially as he's actually been generating a bit of pressure when he's on the field.
Right, and as I've mentioned so many times, this is a thin position. And anytime there's a new name on the horizon, especially somebody who's playing, as Ross just pointed out, and this is someone that has stood out to me, and I'll be honest with you, I've put in waiver claims for both these gentlemen heading into the next week. And what's interesting is, the Cardinals really need help with the pass rush. Obviously, Calais Campbell's gone. And we mentioned that Chandler Jones is quietly having a pretty good season, although he didn't have a very good week 11. But if you look, Chandler Jones leads the team in sacks, and Pierre is number 2 with 2.5 sacks. And then there's a lot of ones spread out throughout that defensive side of the ball. So as I said, this is a team in desperate need of pass rush help. And as their season, again, kind of like the Packers, goes sideways, I think they're going to be looking at the youngsters some more. And so I think, as Ross said, his snap count is trending in the right direction. So again, try to be out in front, ahead of the curve. Get this kid, pick him up, and it could be somebody that you ride down the stretch as the Cardinals look to see what they have.
Indeed, yeah. So in case you didn't catch his name, we obviously talked about him. Olsen Pierre of the Arizona Cardinals and then Davon Godchaux of the Miami Dolphins. Those 2 guys are my waiver wire recommendations this week.
And excellent ones at that. And now we'll move on to the linebacker position. And, some of the names we expect to see having big weeks, had big weeks last week. Vontaze Burfict seems to be rounding into form. He had a very nice game. Telvin Smith. We like both those guys. We liked them before the season. Burfict, as long as he can keep his head on straight, which he's somewhat managing to do. And then there's a few names that Deion Buchanan. We like him. We liked him before the season. He's worked himself up. First, talk a little bit about what those fantasy veterans that we can rely on, how they looked last week.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's great to see the likes of Burfict and Buchanan really getting into their stride, as you said. Buchanan, 13 total tackles and a forced fumble. We had people asking on Twitter, should we be picking up Buchanan? And the answer was a definitive yes. He had a slightly slower start. I think he had a poor first game back. But ever since then, since week 5, he's averaged 9.3 tackles a game. That's a decent stat line. I mean, this is a guy who we did think was probably, top end LB2 if he had a full slate of games. And he's definitely scored like that since he's returned. Burfict, again, draws plenty of controversy because of his rough style of play that's drawn plenty of penalties and suspensions, as well as potentially other off-field issues. But 12 total tackles, 11 of which was solo, added a sack and a forced fumble. He's definitely, like you say, revving up. If you were someone who took a bit of a chance on Burfict in the draft because he dropped because of missing those first few games of the year, he's paying dividends for you now. And then Telvin Smith, again, this guy has really turned into a stud over the last few seasons. Even on a down day, only 5 total tackles, which is well below what we would expect from him normally. He added an interception and a fumble return for touchdown. Smith, for me, is the perfect, one of the perfect kind of models of IDP linebacker. The same as Wagner, same as Patrick Willis was back in the day, Darrell Washington as well. Just a really dynamic playmaker. He racks up 100 total tackles pretty much every single season now, and he offers big splash play potential every time he's on the field.
I was just going to second that opinion because that's what we love. We love somebody who consistently put up tackles for us. We've kind of got a floor of what we expect for them, and that's tackle production. And then when they have the natural ability and the instincts to put up those big plays, that's just that's the cherry on top of the sundae, and that's what Telvin Smith is. And I'll say that's pretty much what that whole Jacksonville defense has been this year. I mean, at every level, this team is getting it done, and that defense is fun to watch. Telvin Smith's definitely fun to watch, and tell you what, it was fun to watch Jamie Burgess Jr. last week stepping in there for Jamie Collins. Once Collins is out, you got to like what Burgess did.
Yes. I mean, we did touch on the Browns linebackers last week, and obviously we're going to touch on them again right now. But Burgess was a player we did talk of, although we weren't filled with confidence that he was going to have a great stat line. I think it was a good matchup, and we knew he was going to play. He seemed like the obvious replacement. But 16 total tackles and a sack. It was a hell of a performance. Slight caveat that only 7 are solo, but those points still count even if they're not solo tackles. Most notably, he played 71 of 78 snaps, so he is their go-to guy. He's going to be the full-time replacement. I can't imagine he's going to lose any of those snaps, considering he was a productive performer on Sunday.
Right, and his teammate Christian Kirksey had a nice little day for himself as well.
He certainly did. 13 total tackles, 8 which were solo, so we can see a bit of crossover between Kirksey and Burgess there. He also had a sack and a forced fumble, but we've gone back and forth a little bit over Kirksey and Joe Schobert over the first few weeks of the season. But as we progress, we're moving into the second half, and the latter stage of the season, it's certainly been Kirksey who's established his authority as the IDP asset to own in Cleveland. He's averaged 11 total tackles per game over the last 5 weeks. That is not a return to sniff at.
Right, and I'm sure we'll touch on this in the matchups part. Keep in mind that Cleveland played Jacksonville last week. That's a lot of tackles given up to linebackers, and that's what we like to call a tease, because we'll touch on that a little bit later. And this last name we're going to touch on is interesting to me. It's just because I like the numbers he's been putting up, and I like the way this is another guy whose snaps are coming to a nice level. That's Matthew Judon of the Baltimore Ravens, who got two more sacks last week.
He did. It was a very impressive performance. He also added 7 total tackles to really pad his numbers out. So he's a player we want to keep a slight eye on. He, like you say, he's a little bit up and down. He's had one back in week 6 against the Bears. He had 14 total tackles and a sack. He also had 5 total tackles and a sack the week before last in week 9 against Tennessee. So these, since week 6, he has been a little bit more of a presence on the field, and I'm not quite sure I'd really want to quite start him anytime yet, but I wouldn't be adverse to picking him up in a deeper league.
Right. As I mentioned, I looked it up. I was interested in the kid, and he's playing 70% of the snaps at left outside linebacker. He's playing opposite P. Sizzle, who has 7.5 sacks. Judon has 5 sacks on the season, and he's got 33 solos. As you said, he had a good tackle performance a couple weeks back. So, as you mentioned, an interesting name to maybe grab and stash, because he's shown the ability to put up some tackle numbers, but also get to the quarterback. And we're going to get to the waiver wire. And I like these two this week. I think it's one in particular I'm very interested in would be the second one. But first, let's touch on Christian Jones of the Chicago Bears and why you think folks should be snatching him off the wire.
Yeah, Jones is a player who's been it's been interesting to me. He's been around for a few years now. He's an undrafted free agent back in 2014. But went undrafted because of rumors about failing a drug test at the combine. He actually was a bit more of he was more talented than that. Probably didn't deserve to go undrafted, but he's just never really caught on in Chicago. He's kind of almost earned themselves the starting job, and they seem to have gone in other directions. And we thought it was going to be, the preseason as well. We thought maybe he had a bit of a sniff of a job, but it was Danny Trevathan and Jarrell Freeman. They were brought in and over the last few seasons. But their injuries and suspensions have really opened the door for him, and he's been productive when on the field. In each of the last 6 games, he's had double-digit fantasy points, and he's had at least 7 tackles in all of those games. He added a sack against your Lions on Sunday. He doesn't jump out as a sexy pick, but he scores points, and points win prizes. And if you want prizes, you want to go after points. So Christian Jones, for me, I think he's a wise pickup.
All excellent points. That's why you need to listen to the waiver wire, folks. Ross is speaking gold here. And boy, this next player, it's taken a bit of a circuitous route. I don't know if I said that right, but to finally get onto the field, this is someone who, in the preseason, I'm sure as we were breaking him down, perhaps we were talking about how he might be the starting middle linebacker for the Buffalo Bills. And, well, lo and behold, we're heading into week 12 of the season, and Reggie Ragland no longer plays for Buffalo, but he plays for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he might just be making his move.
Agreed. Now, I think Ragland, I want to say that Ragland's my favourite waiver wire pickup, but I know who's coming at defensive back this week. But Reggie Ragland, I really like this pickup. Like you're seeming to hint that you do as well. If you want Ragland, you've got to go now, I think, because we're going to find out pretty quickly if he's a fantasy must-have or not. Like you said, he was transferred, traded or picked up traded to the Chiefs for a 4th-round pick when he was originally a 2nd-round draft pick who never saw the field in Buffalo thanks to an ACL injury. The scheme change there really didn't suit him, and he's found much more. He's found at home in Kansas where the 3-4 system really suits him. Last week he saw his first significant playing time. Really, he'd only been used sparingly before. Barely seeing over 20 snaps in a game, but 47 of 69 snaps last week, and he managed to parlay that into 9 total tackles, 8 of which were solos and 4 of which were stops. He was impressive enough to be the 2nd highest graded linebacker playing football last week, so when you consider some of the people in the league, that's a pretty decent stat. And he also paced all of the Chiefs' inside linebackers at snap. So I'm really, we've talked about Derek Johnson being old. We've talked about whether Ramik Wilson is going to be the answer. And I think the answer, what we're trying to see here is that Ragland is the one they're cluing in on. And I think progress a few weeks past this, and I think we're really going to see Ragland racking up a lot more snaps and putting up some fantasy points. So for me, Ragland is a definite add, and I'd probably prefer him to Jones, which is, considering I like my consistency and I like my scoring, the fact I want to take Ragland over Jones says something.
I agree. Alabama linebackers, they tend to work out. Maybe they tend to burn out a little bit earlier just because of the rigors of playing for Alabama, but they can definitely make some noise. It looks like Ragland's time is coming. Obviously, in Dynasty, you definitely want to have him. In case his snaps don't continue to increase, but I don't see any reason why they won't, especially coming off a performance like that. And as you touched on, and Derek Johnson's a lot closer to the end of his career than he is to the beginning. And speaking of beginning of careers, that's going to bring us to the defensive backs and some of the top performers. And I'll mention his name, and I don't know if you want to go ahead and talk at length about him, and maybe we'll jump ahead. You know what I'll do? I'm going to change on the fly. Let's talk about Landon Collins and the really big week that he had. And then we'll talk about the next player who had an even bigger week.
Indeed, yeah, Landon Collins. He's been a little bit of an enigma this year. Really struggled to put up the fantasy points we've come to expect from him since he's joined the league. But 15 total tackles and an interception really rectified some of that. I get the feeling that injuries have been slowing him. So the fact that this was his first double-digit tackle performance, it's pretty surprising. This is a guy who fully earned the number 1 DB spot last year. So the fact he's lit it up this week puts a smile on my face.
Right, and should put a bit of a smile on Giants fans' faces as they managed to get a win. But boy, this has just been a bad year in general for the Giants, and I think Landon Collins kind of epitomizes that. As like you said, he definitely deserved to be the number 1 defensive back coming out, and then the season just went. I'm not even going to use it went sideways for the Giants. It went downhill quick. And let's touch on another couple players before we get to the big name of the week. I'm really teasing this guy hard, but we're going to have some fun talking about him. But Jordan Poyer continuing to get it done.
Yeah, again, a surprising player who's, we highlighted a little bit earlier in the season as a guy who was performing and we thought could stick around. Missed a couple of games through injury, but 11 total tackles last week and 8 solos. Added a couple of passes defended. He's really been straight back into the groove. 21 total tackles over the last 2 weeks. If Poyer somehow is kicking around your waiver wire, I hope he isn't by now. He might be in shallower leagues. He is someone I would go and grab.
All right, and another player who, and this was a situation in New Orleans that we talked about early in the season, even maybe up until the middle of the season. It was hard to figure out their secondary as players were getting benched. Snap counts were wacky, but it looks like Von Bell is finally the man that we can go ahead and start on a weekly basis for the Saints and feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, Von Bell. As you say, there was back and forth. Is he the guy? Is he not the guy? But last week showed that with Vaccaro out, he certainly might be the guy you want to clue in on in the Saints secondary, thanks to 13 total tackles, 10 solo, added a sack and a forced fumble. Bell, he's the guy right now. Whether he's going to be the guy next season and moving forward, we'll have to wait and see.
Right, and I think he might just be the guy moving forward. I think Vaccaro's on a contract year. And as you said, he's hurt right now. He fell out of favor early, but then went right back to garnering all the snaps. But if Bell continues to play that way, then I think it'll be pretty easy for the Saints to let Vaccaro walk. And that brings us to one of the top performers of the week, and it's going to segue right into the waiver wire. That's Budda Baker of the Arizona Cardinals. Ross, go ahead and wax poetic about what this kid did.
Wow. Well, I did recommend him last week, but we have to recommend him again in case you were on the fence. There is no fence. He fully deserves to be on the right side of it. 13 total tackles, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery, and a sack. What a performance. Put up plenty of fantasy points. Bearing in mind just last week he was brought in midway through the game to replace Tyvon Branch, who had succumbed to injury, and he added 9 total tackles in just 44 snaps. We're literally walking into the fantasy playoffs, and this guy is probably on most waiver wires, and he's a top 5 DB, arguably top 3. Branch had been scoring like that, and this guy is scoring as much and if not more. We've got a small sample size, but yeah, if you did take my advice last week and go and grab this guy, you have hit the jackpot. Budda Baker is here to stay.
Oh yeah, and he played 70 snaps last week. I mean, he was everything you want in a starting safety from a fantasy standpoint. Outsnapped Antoine Bethea, who played 56 snaps and finished with 2 total tackles, 3 assists, 2 solo tackles, 3 assists, 5 total tackles. So, boy, yeah, I'm kicking myself. I wrote it in my notes because I picked him up last week. I read Ross's waiver wire. I listened to Ross on this show, and I picked him up and decided I would take a wait and see. Let's make sure that they don't try to lean on the veteran Bethea and maybe try to ease Baker in and maybe not a full complement of snaps. I did the old paralysis by overanalysis, left him on some benches, and I'm kicking myself, and I will not make that mistake again. This is a guy that deserves being, as Ross mentioned, first of all, picked up if he's on the waiver wire, number one. Make him your top ad, and then put him in your lineup and just enjoy the points that he puts up.
I think you're kicking yourself a bit too hard. I think there's a legitimate reason why you couldn't have started Baker last week. You say paralysis by analysis, but what I'm hearing is cautious, astute management of your fantasy roster when we're getting close to the end of the season, Wally. So as much as I said to pick him up, I didn't say plug him straight in necessarily. So, he was running into a productive spot, but we've seen players, assume roles where there'd been fantasy points before and not deliver. So, the signs were kind of there, but I'm not against showing a little bit of patience and caution. So I don't think you should beat yourself up too much.
Well, all right, I'll give myself a bit of a break. But anytime you see those points sitting on your bench, you can't help but kind of get that little kick in the gut feeling. But it won't happen moving forward because the kid is not going to be on my bench. And speaking of not being on the bench, this next player for the Tennessee Titans, he doesn't see the bench too often, Ross. He's one of the rare two-way players.
Exactly. I mean, this is what I mean. The waiver wire this week is absolutely stacked. Baker's fully confirmed himself, and now you've got this guy, Adoree Jackson, the Titans' first round rookie. He's been playing well on defense. Not amazing because he's a cornerback, so you tend to want to be in a cornerback required league. But he's doing okay. But over the last 3 games, he's seen 5 carries on offense, registering 55 yards, and that's just points that you. It's just points, extra points as a defender in a position where you really, really want them. You've got to add in as well. He's a really dynamic kick returner. 8 touchdowns in college, return touchdowns. Also scored receiving touchdowns in college. I believe he's the highest graded kick returner on the site at the minute. So what we're looking at is a solid IDP defender who's got an offensive angle, who's seeing offensive touches and a dynamic kick returner. We just waxed lyrical about Baker, and I would tell people if you're coming up against the number 1 seed in the playoffs and you don't fancy your chances and you need a defensive back, you should be picking up Jackson instead, because Jackson's upside is a lot higher because of these offensive snaps. All he needs to do is break a big carry for a touchdown and return a kick and have a normal defensive game, and he'll be the highest scoring IDP player that week. That's an upside you can't overlook. If you're an underdog, as much as I'm telling you Baker is almost a lock for the top 5, underdogs should be looking at Jackson instead. I feel almost it's like counterintuitive to tell you to avoid a top 5 defensive back, but if this guy's there and you need points, I'd almost prefer him. You've got to swing for the fences in the playoffs.
Right, a true jack of all trades, as you mentioned, all the different ways he's being utilized by the Titans, and then it just kind of look, and it caught my eye because obviously he's being used. He had 11 solo tackles last week. Now I'm not saying you can expect that every week, but hey, it shows that the kid's going to put his nose in there. He's going to make some tackles for you, and then as you said, he brings all that other upside with all those other facets of his game. So yeah, those are a couple of great waiver wire ads. So again, I hope you're taking notes, and I hope as soon as you're done listening to this. Well, hopefully you've read Ross's article already, but if you haven't read the article, then maybe you just listen to the podcast. You run to the computer and you make your league site and you make these waiver wire claims. And now let's head into some matchups. We got about 8 minutes to go or so, and we'll talk about some edge rushers. We touched on one of these gentlemen earlier. We like Matthew Judon and Terrell Suggs this week against the Texans.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Judon's just come off the back of a nice game, and Suggs is the team's sack leader. The Texans have been a great matchup. We've probably talked about them for a few weeks in a row now, but they continue to be so. If you want points from edge rushers, the Texans are a great way to get them. Suggs and Judon, fringe fantasy starters, potentially in deeper leagues, you'd want to plug them in this week.
Yep, and then Broncos offense continues to struggle. Just no consistent or good quarterback play. Struggling to protect their quarterback, so we like us a couple of I almost said Los Angeles Raiders. There's too many teams in LA. Oakland Raiders. We like a couple of Oakland Raiders. Soon to be the Vegas Raiders, I think.
We do. I think Mario Edwards is my favorite pass rusher when it comes to pure pass rushing ability in Oakland. But I don't think we can discount Khalil Mack. He hasn't quite had the pass rush impact he has in previous seasons, but he's always a threat. He is a playmaker we need to be aware of. So I think if you're a person who owns Mac, I think you could find a reason to start him this week. And if you're in a deeper league and you own Edwards, he would also be considered for me if you're starting a second defensive end.
Okay, and the Eagles have been a pretty positive matchup for opposing edge rushers, so that means Akeem Hicks could be in for a surprisingly good day.
I think so. Hicks is one of those quiet performers. He just puts up decent tackle totals week in, week out. He's probably good for 6 to 8 snaps in the sacks in a season. He's probably close to that already. I just like Hicks again. If you're looking at the fringes of your roster or trying to find someone potentially on a waiver wire that could step in and help you because of a matchup, Hicks is the guy this week.
Right, and a couple of matchups that we don't like. The Chargers are not a good matchup for edge rushers, so that means, while folks may not be benching DeMarcus Lawrence, that's one of those temper your expectation type of deals.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, we're talking as well about a Thanksgiving game, so you want to make sure you're aware of this early. If you start one defensive lineman and you've got a really good choice between more than just Marcus Lawrence, you might want to consider benching him.
And actually these next two guys they play for New England, and I would have no problem benching either one in this very negative matchup. And actually, the Patriots in general struggle to get to the quarterback. I was just kind of looking this up. They have 17 sacks on the season, and both of these guys haven't really produced lately. And I think Trey Flowers and Dietrich Wise, Ross has astutely put down in a negative matchup.
Yeah, it's really strange to talk about New England not generating pass rush. Like, it feels to me like they are always one of the most productive teams when it comes to disrupting quarterbacks. So, yeah, negative matchup, and Flowers and Wise were both fringe fantasy assets anyway this season, so they've got to be firmly on your bench this week.
Right, and the Steelers are a negative matchup. The Packers are running out of pass rush options. We talked about Clay Matthews being injured. Is there anybody you'd start on the Packers this week from the edge position in this tough matchup?
Nick Perry's the only name that comes to mind, but he's been very hit and miss. Obviously, he had 3 sacks just a couple of weeks ago, which have helped to pad his stats. But in this matchup, for me, he's got to ride the pine.
All right, let's move on to some off-the-ball linebackers. We've got just about 4 minutes to go. We're always good at bringing it home on time. And I liked him last week, and he had a pretty decent game, but he's got a nice matchup again this week, and that's Benardrick McKinney.
Yeah, McKinney's been a player who we were hoping would push on into the LB1 territory this year. Maybe quite hasn't achieved that, but he's been by no means a letdown. He's in a great matchup this week. Hopefully he can hit double-digit tackles and push on.
Right, and the Bills are always a plus matchup going against linebackers. We talked about Reggie Ragland. We can like both him and Derek Johnson this week, it looks like.
Of the two, I think Ragland's the one I want to lean to, especially bearing in mind this is against Ragland's former team, the Bills, that cut bait without even giving him a single snap. Now, you could argue that he was injured for most of that time, but the change of scheme didn't help. But Ragland's going to be fired up. He's going to have a chip on his shoulder. This could be the game that helps him really break out, I think.
Right, revenge is a great motivator, and great matchups are what we look for here. And we just talked earlier about the number of tackles that the Cleveland linebackers put up last week against Jacksonville. So that's got to have Dion Buchanan and Carlos Dansby owners salivating at this matchup.
Indeed, Buchanan's certainly the one to lead with. It's not outside the realms of possibility he could be the top scoring fantasy linebacker 2 weeks in a row, based on the fact this matchup is certainly a plus.
All right, now we'll talk quickly about some negative matchups here at linebacker. I mean, the first one, and I'll take this one real quick. It's the Giants against the Redskins, and the Giants are pretty much plumb out of linebackers, folks. B.J. Goodson hasn't played since week 7 with an ankle issue. He didn't practice yesterday, so they brought in was it Calvin Shepard to play last week. He got hurt. He actually got significant snaps. He's not playing, so it looked like Calvin Munson might get another chance to contribute, and he was. Well, now Ross, he's got a quad injury, and he did not practice on Monday. So I think, is this just a steer clear situation with the Giants linebackers?
Run away from these Giants linebackers. When are they ever going to get one that's actually meaningful? I'd love to see them draft one, because we'd be, second round, the kind of time when you take a prime IDP rookie linebacker, someone you want to get stuck into for fantasy purposes, because they are crying out for someone. They really are.
That's right. And we thought it might be B.J. Goodson, but it wasn't. And another, I'll just mention their names, and you mentioned why you're not keen on them this week with their matchups. Brandon Marshall against the Raiders, and then we're not really keen on the Cleveland linebackers.
We're not, just the matchups don't really work. The game plan and what we've seen previously in the season, we've got a pretty decent amount of data behind us now, 11 weeks of football. So when these matchups are, this stage of the season, we can be pretty confident in the points against kind of numbers we're looking at. But yeah, if you're an owner of one of those very productive Cleveland linebackers, you might be a little bit disappointed with your return this week, and especially for anyone who's going to pursue Jamie Burgess off the waiver wire.
Right, maybe grab him and stash him. Now let's talk about the defensive backs. 3 matchups that you like. Touch on these briefly. We like Malcolm Jenkins against the Bears. Well, we always like Rashad Jones, but he's got a very nice matchup against New England. And then we like Justin Simmons, and also maybe some Will Parks this week in that matchup with the Raiders.
Yeah, well, none of these matchups jump out as being absolutely exceptional, but they are above average. So you're going to start Jones every single week. He's also a point-scoring monster, so expect him to have one of his usual performances. But I think if you're in a deeper league, I've got a vague interest in Will Parks. I think his usage has been down in the box a little bit more, sneaking in a couple of snaps. I wouldn't want to get too carried away. But yeah, if you're in a deeper league and you want to grab someone off the waiver wire, Parks might be of interest.
Right, they're probably going to see a lot of beast mode Marshawn, so a chance to get down there in the box and make some tackles, and then some negative matchups. Not really high on Andre Hell this week against the Ravens.
No, he is a player who has been playing himself into fantasy relevance over the last few weeks, but this is a negative matchup. It's worse than the good matchups are good, if you know what I mean. So yeah, keep Andre Howell on the bench if you're an owner of him this week. The same goes for Sean Davis against the Packers, and then another Thanksgiving Day match, the Cowboys against the Chargers. We've clued in on some of these Charger safeties in recent weeks, Jahil Adai being one of the main ones. But I'd really want to be quite wary that this isn't a good matchup.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's Ross breaking down the matchups as only Ross can. Again, the pencil and paper better be working feverishly when Ross is handing out that matchup advice, because these are the decisions that are going to help you get to those fantasy playoffs, bring home that IDP title. And speaking of taking it home, Ross, go ahead.
Cheers, Wally, and thanks as always for an enjoyable conversation about the IDP realms. But until next week, guys, adios amigos.